This is a Dog Nation special. Unmatched coverage of UGA in the postseason is brought to you by Kroger, Royal Caribbean, Jittery Joe's Coffee, and
Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Happy Tuesday afternoon here. It's been a very busy day here, and so Jeff Sentell and I are going to try and wrap things up for you. I'm sure you've missed some form of news today, and so we're going to go through the guys who just gotten in the transfer portal, who's declared for the draft so far, who's coming back. A lot of news there. We start with the latest here. I think that this is perhaps the most impactful. Georgia's landed 3 players out of the transfer portal today, none bigger both physically and in a metaphorical sense than Noah Thomas, 6'6" wide receiver, proven production in the SEC, 8 touchdowns a season ago. Jeff, after the Sugar Bowl, Kirby Smart said this offense needs more playmakers. It landed Zachariah Branch on Sunday. It goes out now, and it adds Noah Thomas to this room. And this is a major, major addition for James Coley, who I think has gone out and put an effective stamp on what he wants his wide receiver room to look like thus far.
Yeah, Connor, I think I wrote in a story earlier this week that Coley's mantra was change the game. Well, man, he's flipped the room, changed the room whatsoever. I mean, Connor, we can simply look at this in terms of 2 things. Number one, I think Georgia, when you combine now Thomas with what happens with ETN and maybe Dylan Bell as well, I think the 2025 Georgia offense, you're really good with numbers. I think there's probably about 20 to 25 touchdowns there for Georgia's 2025 offense. And you think about what would have happened before. And, there's some good and bad with Noah Thomas. Let's be real here. Like, he doesn't have first, all the good stuff. He runs really, really fast. He's 6 feet, 6 inches. He had 8 touchdown catches, which would have led Georgia on a Texas A&M offense, I believe, that had 19 or 20 total touchdown passes, catches, receptions all year. He would have led Georgia. So that's something. He's 6'6". He's really fast. There is a relationship there with Coach Coley. They spent about 3 or 4 seasons there together at A&M. But let's be real. Let's tell people, Connor, he does not have tractor beams for hands, but the dude's going to be open. He's going to draw some doubles. And you pair Noah Thomas with Zachariah Branch, and all of a sudden, you remember our upstanding colleague, Brandon Adams, who was basically pining, like say anything with a boombox over his head about basically he needed some superstars on offense. Well, I don't know if they're 100 million watts so superstars, but there are definitely some stars, and I don't mean 5 stars, 4 stars. These are guys that will start for Georgia next year.
Not to mention, they bring in Talon Taylor. I think, as you've pointed out, you've written this week, he's down in San Antonio this week for the All-American Bowl. A lot of eyes on what Taylor can potentially bring right away. And there are 2 sorts of things here that I want to touch on that you just responded to there. One, the talent in this wide receiver room is undeniably better in 2025 than it was in 2024. And it's important to point out here, this team could add back in Colby Young to the mix as well because of the JUCO rule change stemming from the Diego Pavia trial. Young has been afforded an extra year of eligibility. Now he is still currently away from the team, suspended as he awaits trial for his October arrest. But should those charges get cleared up, and I'm not predicting they are, because anyone that has tried predicting anything when it comes to Colby Young has sort of been wrong at this point. So we've got to see this court case play out in that regard. But you have Colby Young, you have Noah Thomas, you have 2 big-bodied wide receivers to go along with the freshman in CJ Wiley, who has that sort of body type there as well. The Georgia just didn't have this past season. And so that forces you to defend this team a different way. You have Nitro Tuggle, who maybe you can move back into sort of that flanker, that Z receiver role. You have London Humphreys there as well. And then you have those short, speedy guys like a Talon Taylor, like a Zachariah Branch that you can play in the slot. And you have, I think, a more capable and full offensive playmakers to build around. But I will point this out here as well, and you touch on Noah Thomas, his issue with hands, the drops. I was willing to maybe overlook some of the drops issues this year because of the fact that I think so much of that is just a mental thing and it comes and goes. Ladd McConkey had issues with drops during his time at UGA back during the 2022 season, and he was able to figure that out and get that turned around. So I think drops can be the sort of a one-season issue or a short-term issue. But if Georgia has drops issues again in 2025 when they've upgraded the talent there, that becomes a much bigger concern about this wide receiver position. But I've held the belief that the issue with this Georgia offense this year was the talent and the talent around Carson Beck. I think they've done everything they can thus far to address that, whether it be bringing in guys via the portal like Zachariah Branch or Noah Thomas, or bringing back guys back like a Dylan Bell, and as our colleague Mike Griffith reports, as expected now, Trevor Etienne to return there as well. It is a loaded room at wide receiver, tight end, and now running back.
Yeah, there's a lot. And, Connor, I think when you look at a lot of this, you have Georgia. I mean, they didn't have anything like that. What's the popular meme you see on social media where Leonardo DiCaprio is like pointing at the television? I can imagine Carson Beck next year looking at Georgia's offense going, yeah, that's what I was looking for. That's what it's really just like, I'm buying with what you're selling about, hey, it's okay to drop a few as long as you catch more of them, as long as you catch the big ones, as long as it's just something that's just not deflating like a certain drop in the Sugar Bowl, which looked like a microcosm of the entire season. And, another thing, Connor, the transfer portal giveth and the transfer portal taketh. And, listen, let's not underscore. Georgia got 2 safeties in the transaction wire report today, which is necessary for safety depth. I still wonder about Chris Peel coming in and maybe being a starter next year for Georgia at safety. But now they got a lot of veterans that have been around college football to add to this safety. But Connor, I don't think anybody really cares about Georgia and safeties with the news cycle of today. I mean, it's almost reached the point, man, where you're looking at it and you're going to go, did the zero-sum game, did the transfer portal help Georgia more than it hurt Georgia this year? And I think when you look at the glaring deficiencies of this team and you look at what they've done offensively with 2 guys, I mean, Connor, we didn't really go crazy on the Zachariah Branch stuff, but I'm going to tell you, I saw this guy with my own eyes. I don't think there's a drops issue with him. I think that was a tepid USC offense this past year. Everybody can kind of live with some drops, but Zachariah Branch will be immediately open. He will create instant separation. And listen, everybody that's a big fan of that screen game, it's going to be a little bit cooler throwing that screen out to a guy that could make 2 elephants miss in a bathtub, or a guy like Noah Thomas, who is like, okay, put that 6'6" joker on the ground with our screen game as well, with Georgia's screen game as well. So weapons, sticks of dynamite, whatever you want to say it, Georgia got a lot better today, especially in the span of about an hour.
Yeah, and you mentioned there, one was Zachariah Branch. Like, USC was such a mess this season. They're changing quarterbacks. They go to Jade Maeva late in the season there. I think it's a situation where you might be able to get a Zachariah Branch, a player Georgia traditionally has not had, and get him maybe at a discounted rate than what you normally get. The other big news, and this just comes in according to Chris Hummer. It was first reported yesterday this player planned to enter. He's now officially in the transfer portal. That is Damon Wilson. Jeff, you mentioned a second ago, the portal giveth and the portal taketh away. I think Georgia has added far more from the portal than what they have potentially lost. But of the guys so far that have exited the program via the transfer portal, only 10 so far, and the deadline is rapidly approaching. Players have to be in the portal by tonight for that to have been met, because Georgia season, as far goes, it seems, ended 5 days ago at this point in time, but Damon Wilson officially in the transfer portal. And I think when you and I talked earlier today, we're sort of both on the same page when it comes to this move.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where you think he could look around the room and he could see 2 outside linebackers being projected in the first 20 picks of the NFL draft. But I think his definition is he's kind of saw what Mykel Williams did this year. And Mykel didn't have that double-digit sack season. He didn't have that tremendous havoc year. And let's face it, Connor, I can tell the story of Damon Wilson and how it was a knuckle fight. It was a bare knuckle brawl for Georgia to pull him away from Ohio State as it was years ago when he was coming out as a 2023 recruit. And you want to think, this is a pretty clear read, is that the transfer portal usually doesn't claim key starters. And Wilson was slated to be a starter next year, but man, they've still got Quintavious Johnson. They've still got Joseph Jonah Ajonye. There's Isaiah Gibson. And I think, Connor, we've reached a point in college football whether you either have your guy and then everything else behind him is either going to be a freshman or a redshirt freshman, and that's all you can expect. And The only other, this was one of those I think Georgia will feel. It's one of those that Georgia was fighting to keep out of the portal. Connor, sometimes now when I look at recruiters, I had this conversation with a lot of Georgia assistants at Sugar Bowl Media Day, and I was like, man, recruiter probably means just as much retainer now as it does recruiter, in terms of you got to keep your own guys in-house. And the only other, I would say, I don't know if you've got your internal Rolodex of rankings, Connor, but the only other transfer portal guy that I think has hurt Georgia quite to the extent that Damon could, probably A.D. Mitchell. I think that's maybe the only one that you sit there and go, wow, that's somebody Georgia would have loved to keep. We all know the reasons why A.D. went to Texas, but A.D. had also done a lot more on the field, substantial Georgia moments than Damon Wilson was. But I'll tell you what, I did see him. The impression that Damon Wilson left me with at the end of the Sugar Bowl was that he was really in Riley Leonard's face a lot, knocking him down, making it a not so nice evening for him, pressuring him, harassing him. And it left you thinking, all right, Damon Wilson's going to be just fine next year. And turns out he may be just fine for some other roster. But we all know, Connor, Georgia is going to have the hosses and the horses on defense. I mean, we can talk about Damon Wilson, former five-star great, but he only had like probably 15 tackles, 20 tackles, and 3 sacks a year ago. This past year, I believe you can get that out of an Isaiah Gibson this year. I believe you could get it perhaps out of a Joseph Jonah Ajonye as well. It's not like Georgia doesn't have guys. It's just they don't have guy on top of guy on top of guy, and then you throw in the freshman.
Yeah, and it's not to say that we're going to gloss over this loss. Like, this is a guy that Georgia was counting on to play a role for them next season. But at the same point in time, we've seen players from this outside linebacker position before from Georgia transfer, I think even for the very same reasons that Damon Wilson is looking to transfer. Brenton Cox, though, he was more of a competition-based than looking for a different role type. Jermaine Johnson, I think this is maybe a carbon copy of that transfer decision where Jermaine Johnson was looking for better numbers, a more defined role. He goes to Florida State. He goes on to become a first-round pick after a year at Florida State there. There's some just a season ago, Marvin Jones Jr. leaves Georgia at the outside linebacker position, goes to Florida State. He's now transferred once again and is going to Oklahoma there. So it's a position at Georgia that, yes, they've recruited very well at. They try to recruit very well at all levels in the defense. But no matter who's been the defensive coordinator, whether it's been Dan Lanning, whether it's been Mel Tucker, whether it's currently Glenn Schumann, no matter what influence Will Muschamp has had in this group, Kirby Smart always wants to build this defense through the spine. That means defensive tackles, that means inside linebackers, and that means safeties. I think defensive tackle, even losing guys like Warren Brinson and now Stackhouse, with the return of Christian Miller next year, with Xavier McLeod, with Jordan Hall, with what you might be able to get going forward, and then obviously 5-star Elijah Griffin there, I think you have a strong spine of your defense. Inside linebacker is once again going to be a strength with C.J. Allen and Raylan Wilson coming back, and I think just about everybody is excited about what you can see out of Chris Cole and Justin Williams. And then at safety, yes, they do lose Malachi Starks and they lose Dan Jackson. I was really, really impressed this year with what I saw from KJ Bolden, especially him coming forward as a tackler just because of some of the size concerns he had coming in. That guy was physical, and that guy made big plays from Georgia's first third down of the season to its last. And so I'm really excited and interested in seeing how he develops. And then they've used the transfer portal to, I think, give themselves more options at that safety spot. Yes, they could potentially move Janelle Aguero back there, who I don't necessarily know if he was a natural fit at star this season. They could also move some of the guys that they've brought in to that star spot as well. And I think Chris Puil is a very interesting name that you mentioned there as well, moving him from corner to safety, a guy this Georgia class has always really liked. And so the Damon Wilson news, again, it's not something you want. You are not better with him playing elsewhere next season. But with the way that we have seen this Georgia defense play year in, year out, the best versions of that defense always have a really strong spine. And the reality is that outside linebacker is just not that same sort of positional value that this would be if a key inside linebacker, if, say, C.J. Allen was looking to transfer elsewhere.
I think you've got, and I see a lot of comments coming in. There's also Gabe Harris there as well. I'm very high on his game as well. It's just, again, you just can't have the layers of it anymore. It's just not the way college football is built. Sometimes you look at Georgia's offensive line and the fact that they were able to hide Micah Morris and Dylan Fairchild for so many years before their turn finally came. I mean, you're just not going to see that happen anymore. Like Georgia's going to replace, looks like 4 out of its 5 starters at the minimum on the offensive line. But, I think this is a time of year, Connor, where you can only sit there and go, did you get better on your roster? Not on paper, but on your roster. And I think right now we can say on January the 7th that barring anything crazy off the field, because look what happened to Ra, look what happened to Colby Young, this Georgia offensive plan is going to give Gunnar Stockton more weapons than what Carson Beck had for the majority of his 2024 season. And it's either one way you're going to do it. You're either going to spend the money on the quarterbacks or you're going to spend the money on the receivers. It looks like Georgia, Noah Thomas, let's stress this because he was at a very bad situation at A&M. They rotated quarterbacks, and I think 19 touchdown passes. To put that into perspective, Georgia was 33% better throwing touchdown passes for scores than A&M was a year ago, even with some quarterback transition. You get a lot better offensively, and that Connor, we don't need to preach this, but that was the problem in a lot of Georgia's games this year. All those 0, 3, 6-point halves to open the games, and after about 4, 5, 6 times, you realize that, Georgia just doesn't have the weapons. They don't have the ability to put up big quarters and big numbers, especially early on. And I think this will give Georgia a much better chance because, just look at it. If you're a defensive play caller, what are you going to do? So Branch is on one side. Maybe Georgia's in a bunch. You've got Noah Thomas on the other side. You've got a deadly tight end weapon. Maybe it's a Lawson Lucky. Maybe it's even an Elias Williams. You got a threat in the backfield. You've got Gunner's legs already. That looks a lot more promising in terms of it's simply from a defensive play caller's perspective is there wasn't anybody on Georgia's offense where you had to sit there and say, okay, where's that guy? Where does he need to be? I think at minimum, everybody loves the player parallel game. I think Branch can give you Mecole Hardman Jr. type stuff, maybe Isaiah McKenzie type stuff, maybe a range between those two players. And I think you can get a Lawrence Cager-sized impact out of Noah Thomas. And, hey, look what Lawrence Cager did to a pretty devoid Georgia wide receiver room a few years back. I think these two players have the ability to help Georgia a great deal, and it had to happen offensively.
And I think the big thing with Georgia, and this is a point Brandon Adams made very early in the season, there was no easy button for this Georgia team this season, at least on the offensive side of the ball. There was nothing where, okay, we just need to get positive plays and get points on the board. There was nothing they could turn to. And a year ago, they had Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey do that. I'm not saying that Zachariah Branch or Noah Thomas are going to be those guys right away, but you see how if they mesh and they fit well at the University of Georgia, they could be that there. The one other thing on the offense I want to touch on here, Georgia sees 2 more offensive linemen declare for the NFL draft, Jared Wilson and Dylan Fairchild. These guys are going to be top 100 overall picks. I think Tate Ratledge is as well. You see Xavier Truss exhaust his eligibility, and you're looking at it and you're seeing Georgia's losing 4 starters from this offensive line. That should be a major position of concern. I have 2 different sort of points to make on that. One, when Ratledge, Wilson, Fairchild, when those guys get the draft grades that I believe they got, you kind of have to go in that situation, especially when they've done all that they've done. And 2, these guys are really talented, and the offensive line was still an issue for Georgia this season. It was in my opinion, it was the worst offensive line that Georgia has had under Kirby Smart, and there are statistics that back that up. Worst rushing offense they've ever had, most sacks they've ever given up. And yes, some of that can be dictated by opponent, but there's something beyond talent that needs to be figured out with this offensive line here. And look, they've recruited really well, and they've invested very well on this offensive line as well. I know we're really excited about seeing what Daniel Calhoun can possibly do. Ernest Green with a full season of health, if he's able to get healthy, what does he give you, either at tackle or guard? Monroe Freeling, based off what we saw against Notre Dame, needs to make big steps forward there. And then even at center, as good as Jared Wilson was this season, I thought when Drew Bobo came in those 2 starts against Auburn and Mississippi State, yes, those aren't elite defenses, but I was impressed with what Drew Bobo did for the offense there in that game. And I think he's someone at center you can at least trust there. It's not maybe the same transition that you would see at tackle. So with the offensive line, yes, you're losing starters, but this was an offensive line this year that very much underperformed. You can put that on coaching. You can put that on them not gelling as a unit because of injuries and rotations and never getting the 5 best guys consistently out there. Point being, talent to me is not the reason this offensive line struggled this year. And so while, yes, you lose talented players in that regard, there's something deeper there that needs to be figured out with the offensive line. And I think moving forward, while, yes, losing 4 starters emphasizes that was already a big issue in terms of Georgia this offseason, figuring out this offensive line, whether Jared Wilson or Dylan Fairchild are back, and now we know that they are not.
Kind of got two takes. One of them's an interactive take. What will it be like looking around the Georgia offense and seeing, allowing yourself to say, oh my gosh, this guy's playing really well, and it be like a surprise, or it be an astonishment, or it be a measure of growth rather than, okay, about time, or we all expected him to play like the NFL guy. I think, Georgia and the Joe Moore Award, sometimes it's kind of been a bitter taste in their mouth. This was the year that they probably were primed to have as talented a roster on paper to do it. We saw how much Cedric Von Pron meant to that unit, and just in terms of counting numbers in the box, identifying the mic, getting your numbers right, getting your protections right. I think, that went undervalued, I guess, with Cedric. But now if you look at a guy and, like, let's say maybe it's Ja Jackson on one side, Monroe Freeling on the other, and maybe you've got a Marquez Easley, maybe you've got a Daniel Calhoun, you've got a Drew Bobo in there. When that line starts getting pushed, and these will be younger pups doing the pushing, I think that would be somewhat fun to watch Georgia football, if there's a lack of a better term.
Yeah, and to your point, the problem with expectations is they have to be met. And for this Georgia offensive line, they were so high going into this season that anything less than that was going to be a disappointment. And so then when they play as poorly as I think they did in my mind, it only further exacerbates the issue there. One thing that I think you sort of touched on there, and I want to dive into it deeper as a former center here, Gerald Wilson was not a natural center. It was someone that they converted to that position. He played well at times this season. I think you can go back and look at the Alabama game and notice sometimes him struggling there as well. Drew Bobo is a more natural center in that regard. And some of the communication issues, the lateral movement things you see in there. So even though Drew Bobo may not be as talented or as athletic giftedly as Jared Wilson was, because Cedric Van Pran wasn't either, there is a mental component there that I think Drew Bobo maybe gives him an advantage over Jared Wilson in that regard. And so I'm very interested in seeing how maybe getting a more natural center at the position helps them moving forward. You've seen them even identify this in the value of that in recruiting. Cortez Smith Jr., a guy they're bringing in out of Parkview this cycle, who I think does fill that more natural center role if and when they decide to move on from Drew Bobo at that position there. So full day of news for you here. Georgia lands 3 players out of the transfer portal: wide receiver Noah Thomas from Texas A&M, UAB safety Adrian Maddox, who they flipped from Florida, and then Miami safety Jaden Harris there as well. Georgia sees 2 players come back, will elect to return right now for the upcoming season. That's wide receiver Dylan Bell, and that's running back Trevor Etienne. And then they do see a few guys declare for the draft. But Jeff, as we sort of reset the picture and move forward here, what do you sort of looking for when it comes to this Georgia roster and any tweaks or additions they might make?
Yeah, that's a good one, Connor. That was my second point. I'm glad you teed it up there. I think let's let the people watching, they need to know who's left. You kind of see it in the comments section. I think there's decisions to be made, at least formally, by Dominic Lovett. There will be a formal decision made by Tyrion Ingram Dawkins, Oscar Delp. There's a few more periphery guys that you want to make sure, and obviously like a younger player. I'll be honest, I kind of expected more younger offensive linemen to hop into the portal, maybe even some younger safeties, some younger, especially now, Connor, with these 3 veteran safeties coming in. You would have expected to see maybe perhaps some of Georgia's younger safeties maybe consider a shot at the portal or something else like that. So there's a few names left to look at. I mean, with what the Dogs are looking for, I mean, probably the biggest one is another one to think about is Micah Morris. He hasn't made any formal declaration, but man, he's waited a long time. He was a graduate. He's already a graduate of the University of Georgia, still has a lot of eligibility. He has all the promise and potential in the world, but he's kind of never really realized that. The thinking I had was he going to come back to Georgia? Tate's spot would be cleared out. Dylan's spot would be cleared out. And he would kind of be seen as a guy that's gotten some run at Georgia, and sometimes, Connor, in those cases, guys just want a fresh start as well. So perhaps of the bigger names, I think the biggest name to watch and for Dog fans to hope comes back in 2025, I think that might be TID. I wonder what you have to say there.
I think TID is certainly up there, especially given the Damon Wilson news. Just getting guys that can play that defensive end spot or work on the edge there, I think is critical for this Georgia team moving forward. Otherwise, that puts a lot on the plate of Gabe Harris, a guy who's played a little defensive line, but can also, I think, play that outside linebacker position. And then Joseph Jonah Ajanye, who really, I think, needs to take steps forward, had foot surgery, was with the team. In hindsight, I wish I had gotten a chance to speak to him a little bit more at media days last week, but I think he's a guy who I'm super interested in seeing how his development unfolds. There is one guy that we have not yet mentioned That is cornerback Dalen Everett, who was very interesting in the sense that this is a guy that I think made big strides for Georgia over the last 6 or 7 games of the season. Obviously, the SEC championship game MVP with his multiple interceptions. And I thought as a guy that has gotten better, and he's sort of in that spot where he's going to test really well at the NFL Combine. He's got 2 years of starting experience. And he's a guy I think that, has the ability to go pro. I think Georgia would also very much take him back if he wanted to come back. But what that does at the cornerback position, you have Daniel Harris back there, who I think improved as a practice player, still has some things he needs to get better on. And then you've also got Ellis Robinson and DeMello Jones at that cornerback position as well. I think depending on what Dalen Everett does, it makes those next steps for that cornerback position, which I think, if they bring everyone back, could be a very talented room and have, I think, better experience than it did a season ago. But it makes it a very interesting proposition for Dante Williams to get figured out.
Interesting, Connor. Obviously, to me, if you had to look at the one position besides Tyrion Ingram Dawkins is, what's left. I think I wonder about Daniel Harris. Obviously, he caught some criticism for the way he played in the Sugar Bowl game, and I think a lot of it had to do with his physicality and his ability to be a willing and dedicated tackler. And I think Dalen's pursuit would kind of free open a lot of things. If, Daniel might be the type of player that might want to wait and see where things are after spring practice. You can imagine that. He might see how much not only Ellis Robinson the fourth, but also DeMello Jones. Connor, my people told me that DeMello was really looking really strong towards the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season. And he should. He's a top 100 overall prospect that could play a lot of places. And I mean, I hate to keep harping on it, but that is just the new normal. You either have the guys that were starting and the guys that just got there, and that's it. Anybody in between, you can't expect to hold on to them unless you're like a KJ that played a whole lot your freshman year, and it's your turn to step up into the rotation and be that guy. So I think it's going to be a different Georgia team, and I think most fans would probably love to see a team that maybe gets a little sharper teeth on offense. Well, a lot sharper teeth on offense for these Dogs. Maybe have some teeth and not some dentures or some gums in there. But then more so, maybe if you can take a little bit on the defensive side, everybody knows Georgia's defensive units will be strong and well prepared under Glenn Schumann and Kirby Smart.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned there and sort of the way that things changed, that 2023 recruiting class, guys like Damon Wilson, CJ Allen, Raylan Wilson, Monroe Freeling, as it stands right now, and with Damon Wilson officially in the portal, 12 of the 26 players from that 2023 class will not be with the program entering their third year in the program. And I think that just represents the new reality in which we are living in. So very much something to watch moving forward. He's Jeff Sentell. I'm Connor Riley. A full day of news here for you, wrapping things up here. Multiple transfer portal commitments, players returning. We're going to have all that and more covered for you on DawgNation.com, as well as other stories coming out and the impact of this. I know it's a lot of news right now. We'll get to the analysis and the good vibes as well there. You've got Brandon Adams on Dawg Nation Daily tomorrow morning, along with Jeff Sentell doing Before the Hedges Wednesday night with Kaylee Manziel. So plenty of news and notes to look forward to, and we're going to have you guys covered there all the way up until this stuff stops. Transfer portal for Georgia players closes tonight. NFL draft deadline is January 15th if you're looking for deadlines on some of that stuff. But then the portal also reopens in April for 10 days there as well. So the stuff's going to drag on. And as Georgia pieces together what this puzzle is going to look like in 2025, we're getting a better idea of what this team is going to look like. So for Jeff Sentell, I'm Connor Riley. This has been a Dawg Nation breaking news presentation.